at the I hope you grabbed a couple of 3x5 cards and a pencil, because that's how we're going to do a question and answer with Dr. Rose at the conclusion of her speech tonight. Anyway, roll call, please. Roll call.
All right, Dave Beauty.
Here.
Jim?
Yes.
Here. Dave?
Here.
Bill?
Here.
Eric? Here. Tom?
Here.
Jerry? Here.
Thank you. I'll now entertain a motion that the meeting agenda be approved as presented.
Motion to approve the agenda as presented.
Is there support?
Support.
Motion's been made and supported that the meeting agenda be approved as presented. Is there any further board discussion on this motion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. The motion carries. I'll now entertain a motion for the approval of the meeting minutes from September 12th, 2022. Is there support? Second. Motion has been made and supported that the minutes from the September 12th, 2022 minutes meeting be approved as presented. Is there any further board discussion on this motion? Hearing none, all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Thank you. The motion carries. Let's introduce all our Zoom attendees tonight. Scott, you want to introduce yourself?
Good evening. My name is Scott Hall. I'm one of the project engineers with Police and Danbury.
Thank you. And Scott's a very important person here tonight because he's running the computers for the meeting. And then we have Dr. Joan Rose. Joan?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Joan Rose. I'm a professor at Michigan State University. I hold the Homer Nolan Chair in Water Research and very happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Under old business, we have two items under old business. Item number one is the wastewater treatment plant land acquisition. The Michigan DNR has yet to determine what the selling price of the property will be, so we're going to leave that item under old business. Also under old business is a funding update. No decisions from the legislature have been determined yet. We probably won't know until the legislature reconvenes after the election in November. So we'll leave those items open for under old business. Under new business this evening, we're very pleased to have with us this evening Dr. Joan Rose. Just a bit of background on Dr. Rose. She earned her bachelor's degree in microbiology from the University of Arizona, followed by a master's degree in the same subject from the University of Wyoming. She returned to Arizona to obtain a doctorate degree also in microbiology. Rose taught at the University of South Florida until 2003. She serves as the Homer Nolan Chair in Water Research at Michigan State University. Dr. Rose won the excuse me if I mispronounce it, the Altheny Richardson Irving Clark Prize in 2001, and used some of the prize money to start an endowment for the Rose Fellowship at Michigan State University. She was a 2008 recipient of the International Water Association's Hai-Jing Wu Award. Rose was elected to the member of the United States National Academy of Engineering in 2011. For contributions to improving water quality, safety, and public health. In 2015, the government of Singapore granted Rose an honorary citizenship to honor her research for the nation's water infrastructure and quality. The next year, Rose was awarded the Stockholm Water Prize. Dr. Rose is as we mentioned, is a professor at Michigan State University. And she's interested in the nexus of water-related microbiology, water quality, and public health that is rife with uncertainty in both theory and practice. The world is blessed with few individuals who can tackle increasing changing challenges to clean water and health. Thank you. Clean water and health, starting from the state-of-the-art science and dedicated through original research, then moving to professional dissemination, effective lobbying of the legislative area, influencing practitioners and raising general awareness. Dr. Rose is a leading example of this extremely rare breed of talents, and we are pleased to have Dr. Rose with us this evening. And Dr. Rose, the floor is yours.
Well, Geez, thank you so much for that nice introduction. And I'm going to share my screen here. And then make sure everyone can see that. How's that look?
Good.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I only have maybe about a 10-minute, 12-minute presentation just to give you a flavor of some of the work I've done. And then I'll leave the rest of the time for any questions that the group may have, and we'll see how many we can get through. I'm happy to try to answer questions later too, if there's more questions added in the chat or you get more cards, David. So I'm a public health water microbiologist. I try to answer the question, is your water safe? That's kind of we want to just be able to say, yes, it's safe, but it's a very hard question to answer, and that's where I spend my career. I'm actually trained as an environmental virologist. When I took my first wastewater sample in the 1980s, I was actually looking for poliovirus. I feel like we're coming round circle now as we hear about poliovirus showing up in New York again. So I study sewage and I study fecally contaminated water. I actually work between public health and engineering. So I like to understand the risks and monitor these organisms and then look at ways to control them. I address risk of disease and primarily from the sources, the fecal sources, to drinking water or to recreational waters. And I've studied septic tanks since 1990s, particularly in Florida and more recently, of course, here in Michigan. So what are pathogens that are found in sewage and excreta? That's a nice word for SHIT, excreta. And we generally look at 4 classes of types of pathogens. The bacteria, and you've probably heard a lot about some of the bacteria because we use E. coli as our standard measure of fecal contamination. And of course, there's other bacteria that cause disease, a whole array. I'm just giving you a few examples here, like Salmonella and Campylobacter. Of course, there's the viruses. We can find SARS, rotavirus, hepatitis A virus, and poliovirus in sewage, just to mention a few. There's the protozoa and the worms, which are the little animals, the protozoa, Cryptosporidium and Giardia, and then the worms, for example, like Ascaris, helminths, eggs. So why is pathogen type important? Why do I talk about these 4 different groups? Well, one is size. Viruses are very, very small. Then we've got bacteria. We only can see them under the microscope. Then the protozoa, which are larger, and then the helminths, which are very large. And this size is important for removal through filtration, either soil filtration or filtration in treatment systems. It's important in wastewater treatment. It's important in transport to groundwater in particular, or to our surface waters. The other thing that's important about these pathogen types is how they survive in the environment and how they survive treatment systems. It varies very much by organism. I've just given you one example because rotavirus is a virus that we've studied because it causes severe diarrhea in young children. And if it goes from sewage into well water, and most of our groundwater is quite cold, it can survive for a couple of months. And so a long enough time for the next person to get exposed. So pathogen type is important. The other thing to realize about these pathogens is that when we try to control them, we need to remove very large numbers. And I've just given you examples here. In our lingo, in our language, we talk about logs, but that makes no sense to anyone. So I've given you an example here of the percent reductions. So in sewage, we can start out with 1 million of these viruses, bacteria, and protozoa per liter of sewage. And if we reduce 90%, which sounds like a lot, we only reduce them down to 100,000. If we reduce 99%, we reduce them down to 10,000, 99.9%, 1,000, so on and so forth. Now, even a single organism has the capability, if we ingest it, we get it on our fingers, ingest it, goes into our gut, that's where these organisms grow. Even a single organism can cause disease. So that is why when we start with 1 million, we want to look at very large removals to be safe. Now, how does wastewater systems work? The wastewater systems that we use in the United States. So one is the on-site wastewater treatment system. It's been around a long, long time. We used to just use it without water, outhouses. And so we just let the natural water from urine and everything fill up a hole, and then we cover it up. We now have more sophisticated systems that use water, right, to flush our toilets. So they have a tank, the tank that the water and the wastewater goes to, and you can see that tank here. This solids material, it moves the solids. It might remove about 90% of the pathogens in these solids with time, and time is what actually leads to removal of some of these. The water comes off, and we use the soil to absorb the rest of the what we call the effluent or the wastewater that comes from these tanks. Now, this does not remove nutrients or viruses. Viruses are very small. Nutrients are chemicals that are dissolved, and it may remove some of the bacteria. And these organisms and these nutrients move with the water. So the septic tanks work, and they don't back up into our house because they go into the soil, and the water moves either towards groundwater or surface water. And depending on the soil system and where the groundwater is, how deep the groundwater is, if you're in the West, like in Arizona, where the groundwater is very deep, but out here in Michigan, of course, we know we've got fairly shallow groundwaters. So that water moves to groundwater, and also it can move to surface waters. The other thing about septic tanks, and I'd say they're older technology. They're not monitored. It's an individual's responsibility in terms of managing their own wastewater, and they're not monitored. Now, wastewater treatment, on the other hand, also removes solids, but it also treats them. It uses what we call actively an aerobic biological treatment. So you have the solids removed by the tanks, you have an aeration system that degrades some of the oxygen demanding materials, you have another tank, and then of course we use disinfection or chlorine in particular to kill the microbes. So we can kill viruses and bacteria and protozoa with different kinds of disinfection systems. The other thing about wastewater treatment is what we're seeing is add-ons. We can add on treatment to and modify the process so that we can remove nutrients, emerging contaminants like PFAS, and even antibiotics and pharmaceuticals. So we can use these systems to add on and then to remove these what we call contaminants of emerging concern. And of course, wastewater treatment plant falls under the Clean Water Act, and they're highly monitored. Now, I want to just, my last few slides are really about viruses. I'm trained as an environmental virologist, and there's about 100 different kinds of viruses that we can find in sewage. Adenoviruses, respiratory viruses, and what we call the enteric viruses. And they're resistant to, they can be resistant to wastewater treatment. And that's why we use disinfection at the end to try to kill and inactivate these viruses. Now, why are viruses of concern? Well, they're extremely small biological nanoparticles. We can only see them under the electron microscope. So they're small, little, tiny particles. They're persistent. They're very stable and persistent. They're excreted in these high concentrations. As I mentioned before, they can be excreted at 1 million. they need a host to replicate. So in the environment, they're just a tiny little particle moving to try to find the next host. They're generally host specific, although we know now viruses are jumping from animals to humans. And of course, the reason they're persistent and can resist some of our treatment is because they're very simple structure. And probably most of you have seen a picture of SARS on television. Now, one of my good friends, Dr. Mark Bouchard, who has worked in Wisconsin for a couple of decades on viruses, he did one of the best studies I've ever seen. These are expensive studies, but he went out and he evaluated disease in children. And these were in various communities. He monitored to see if they were getting sick. And he found that he could associate the diarrhea in children with virus infection and septic tank density. So now we use this E. coli and bacteria as our indicators, and they didn't have evidence that the wells were contaminated with the bacteria. Remember, as I said, the bacteria are bigger than the viruses. Viruses are very small. And so the viruses could move through the soil and get to the wells, whereas the bacteria could not. Since this paper was published, Mark has done quite a lot of studies on surveillance of both groundwater and surface waters contaminated with viruses from septic tanks. Now, what have we done in Michigan? And I'm happy to talk about my work in Florida as well, if someone wants to ask about it. I did work on septic tanks for about 10 years in Florida. But in Michigan, what we found was, first of all, we didn't have a good database on where all the septic tanks were at the state level. So I worked with my colleague, Dr. Dave Heineman, who's a hydrologist, and his team. And they were able to create this map that you can see with the septic tanks. You can see some of our big cities as we built out from our bigger cities. We built out communities with septic tanks, and we built out with septic tanks in key recreational areas. You can see the red. So that means, you know, the darker the color, the more septic tanks. We also know that about 30% of our Michiganders are on septic tanks. They have their own wells and they have their own septic tanks. So they're really responsible for their own, the safety of their own drinking water and how they manage their wastewater. Now, for quite some time, Michigan, in various places throughout the state in various counties, have been looking at problems with septic tanks contaminating both groundwater and surface waters. This was a study done a report done from 2021. About 10% of the state septic tanks are failing. And failing is sort of how do you measure failure? Well, if it backs up into the house, for sure, you know that's been a failure. You might have pooling in the yard where it doesn't drain into the drain field anymore. It's clogged. And so you get pooling in the surface water. But another type of failure is actually when the wastewater carrying both nutrients and probably viruses, maybe some bacteria, reaches both groundwaters and surface waters. And there's some estimates that about 31 million gallons of raw sewage per day are released through septic tanks into the state of Michigan. You know, I'm a big supporter of both monitoring and of modernizing our wastewater and our drinking water systems. With the infrastructure bill being passed and some funds becoming available, I do believe in having the state and the federal government support our local communities. I worry about rural communities and our smaller communities being left out from getting the funds that they need to modernize and to look towards that future, where we're going. Whenever we invest in water infrastructure, water or wastewater infrastructure, we're really investing in that long-term future, in our grandchildren's future, because that infrastructure becomes an asset. And we know we have some problem areas. We don't know a lot because there's not a good monitoring program for the whole state. But I do worry about us not supporting some of these smaller rural and recreational communities that are important to our to the state of Michigan. Now, one of the studies we did was to actually look at how water flows in the Lower Peninsula. We looked at 64 river systems. This represents 84% of the drainage area in the Lower Peninsula. All these red dots around that map shows where we monitored. And these we were monitoring at the base of a watershed. So, you know, you have a watershed with rivers and streams and coming, and then they come together and they become larger rivers. And eventually all those waters flow to the Great Lakes, one of the Great Lakes, because of the topography of our land. So we were trying to monitor sort of at that funnel at the base of those watershed, these 64 water systems near the Great Lakes. And we were, of course, interested in E. coli, which is our state standard for fecal pollution. But we also used a what we call a microbial source tracking marker. Now, these markers we have, and we can identify whether the fecal pollution comes from humans or cows or pigs or birds. And so we have key markers. And of course, here we were interested in whether it was coming from humans. When we measure E. coli, that comes from all warm-blooded animals. So we don't know where the E. coli comes from. So we use these microbial source tracking markers. Briefly, what we found, we could look at these watersheds, and we could look at where the concentration of this human marker is. These higher concentrations of red you can see, and the lower concentrations in the dark green. And when we started doing an analysis of the sources, the sources of this human marker, fecal marker, which could be septic tanks, wastewater treatment plants, sledges, if they were put on land, we found that the major relationship with increasing human marker in our river systems was increasing septic tanks. So the more septic tanks you had in those watersheds, the more human marker you had in the surface waters. So we learned that we could use these source tracking tools to elucidate important non-point sources and water quality degradation, potentially the need for further investigation of human health risks at larger scales, and identify maybe some key watersheds in some key areas. Part of this study also developed that map on septic tanks so that we could look at where those septic tanks were. And we found that pollution arising from septic systems at this very large scale was likely more important than previously realized. And not only for viruses, but we found that there was a relationship with phosphorus. Now, one thing about phosphorus and nitrogen, these are considered legacy pollutants. When nutrients go into water systems, when they go into groundwater systems, they last a long time. And so it takes a long time for us to clean those up. So we consider, you know, excess phosphorus, excess nitrogen, a legacy pollutant. And of course, I'm a big supporter of monitoring. I feel if we don't monitor, we don't know where to put our dollars, how to correct our problems. Being an environmental virologist, I am concerned with virus contamination of both our recreational waters and our well waters, our drinking waters, and particularly, as I've already said, for our rural communities. I'm going to end right there, and I'm going to stop sharing. I'm happy to speak about any questions you might have or talk about some of the work we did in Florida. We did tracer studies in Florida where we seeded septic tanks and toilets with a virus, both at the coastal systems, but inland where we have sandy soils, and looked at a migration of the virus through the soil system, and also done quite a bit of surveillance on viruses in areas where there was septic tanks associated with high rain events like El Nino, because El Nino really hits the state of Florida quite hard in terms of large rainfall events. So I'm happy to talk about that as well, or any of these other studies that we've done.
Dr. Rose, we're just going to pause for a moment. I'm going to go through the room and collect some questions that our residents have put on cards. And we'll start the question and answer in about, give me 2 or 3 minutes, okay?
Sure, no problem. I should mention that I've also monitored septage, as it's pumped out of the septic tank, and looking at how we better treat septage. Some septage goes to wastewater treatment plants where it's processed. Some goes to special treatment. Some gets lime treated and applied to land. So also looked at septage here and there.
Okay, Dr. Rose, we've got several questions that have come in from the audience. I want to remind the audience that if you have a question that wasn't asked and the session is ended, if you will fill it out with a card, we will get that question down to Dr. Rose and she will send us back an answer, and we'll get it on we'll get it on our township website. Anyway, Tom, would you go ahead and read the questions?
Sure. If I have a newly installed septic system, why should I support a sewer for our area? Did you hear me?
Yes, I heard that. Well, so I'm talking about the collective, a single septic tank, out and away. It's running well, the water's flowing well. I mean, that's when you say, well, my septic tank's working great, because that means the water flows directly into the soil. And this is about the future of these areas where there's a growth of more and more septic tanks. So I think it's a collective responsibility. Even though you're responsible for your own waste, you're also collectively responsible for all the wastewater generated in a watershed. What surprised me about our study, with the 64 watersheds, is that was a 10,000 foot look down at Michigan waters, and we could still see the effects of too many septic tanks in even larger watersheds, where you would think that it's not contributing. So I think each individual has to decide how they want to protect their environment for the future. Yes, my septic tank may be running very well, but when it's collective, and there's a collective application, there may be a problem. The other thing is we don't monitor. So I don't know what your groundwater looks like, or the well of your neighbors, and whether they have nutrients in them or other things, viruses. They haven't been monitored. So, that may be another consideration, is that there may be a lot of uncertainty because we don't have some of the monitoring data in terms of how these septic tanks are impacting waterways. A tracer down the toilet, and a watch for its transport. And in some cases with very sandy, loamy soils, because that's where septic tanks work best, the water and the tracer move very quickly into surface waters and to groundwaters. And so without some of this data, we can't really be certain that it's not causing an issue. We do know that lakes that have been built with homes that had septic tanks on them and then transitioned to wastewater treatment, they've seen an improvement in the lake. They've seen an improvement in clarity, an improvement in algae, and that's both in Michigan and Montana and across the US. So some of these smaller lakes and even some of the large lakes can be quite susceptible over time to degradation.
Okay. I live a quarter mile from the lake. Will my waste get to the lake and neighbors' deep wells?
Well, I don't know what you mean by deep. So the water will eventually move to groundwater and to the surface water. That's water moves, and otherwise it would just pile up and it moves. And that's the hydrology part of it. So eventually the wastewater coming from septic tanks into soil will move to groundwaters and surface waters. And it's a matter of how fast the flows are, the soil type, of course, the distance. What we're seeing is some of the setback distances that we had previously weren't enough, but they're grandfathered in because we didn't really have the data. We didn't have a lot of information on groundwater flows, and when groundwater is moving 10 meters a day, and there's springs in the area, it can move in even faster. It does get to the lake and to groundwater eventually. Now, how much of the contaminant gets there is also uncertain. And again, that depends on the soil and the time. But the water will carry the contaminants with it, and they will eventually start to attenuate or decrease as it moves.
Okay, is there a cost-effective method of identifying failing septic systems at the individual lot level and thus tag them for upgrades?
You know, most failures most siting looks at infiltration rates. So there's you know, how fast does the water move from a tile drain? And of course, the faster it moves, better for the way the septic tank works, but maybe not for the environment. But failure as defined by impacting surface and groundwaters is rarely identified when situating septic tanks. And this is why many states have state ordinances that have a very specific setback distance depending on the type of soil. So they have to characterize the soil type, and then they have setback distances as part of a state sanitary code to try to protect both groundwater and surface waters. So, and that was these setback distances have been built over time with some of the science. And that's what we were doing in Florida as I worked with hydrologists and chemists and other, it was very interdisciplinary to look at in certain areas in Florida, how would we define setback distances? And so that is, you know, if it reaches surface waters or groundwaters at a certain time without attenuation, it's considered a failure. But I don't know of anybody looking at that kind of data in Michigan at this time.
Do septic systems less than 10 years old eliminate 100% of waste fluids and solids in the water table?
No, septic tanks don't eliminate 100% of any of that, you know, any of the material that's in the effluent. Like I said, the water is going to contain bacteria, viruses, and nutrients, pharmaceuticals, anything else that goes in the wastewater. That's gonna end up in the water itself. Now, some of it will be in the sludges that you pump out later, but most of that is going to be in the effluent piece that's going to go into the soil. And then depending on the soil, like I said, then all that material will flow with the wastewater towards with the natural flow of the hydrology towards both groundwater and surface waters. So how much removal will we have? We don't always know how much removal there will be of these different substances. Some pharmaceuticals aren't removed at all by soil, and they move just with the water. They're called conservative contaminants because they conserve. Other things like protozoa are going to get filtered out. They're big. They're going to get stuck in the soil. Bacteria are going to get somewhat filtered out in the soil. Viruses are small enough that they start moving along with the water for the most part. And it's really about time, how much time it takes for that virus to reach the groundwater or surface water. in terms of it dying off naturally.
Do you have a,
And David, I don't know if there's any, if my answers aren't clear, David, maybe you can say, Joan, maybe you could expand, since these are 3x5 cards and it's not a discussion, some of my answers may not be clear. And so if you feel like I'm not, articulating very well, I'm getting too scientific and using too much jargon, just let me know. I'll try to explain it better.
you're doing a good job. Do you have an opinion about the efficiency of step sewer systems versus conventional municipal systems?
Well, the step systems don't discharge to the environment. They go to a wastewater treatment. So they're a collection. It's a collection system. It would take care of that first primary sedimentation, like the sludges would come down, just like in a septic tank. And then all the water would be pumped out. None of it would go to the environment, and it would go to then a conventional treatment plant where it would be treated with other wastewaters. And so I think they're good systems. They're fairly new, and when they put them in, they don't leak. So that's the main thing, is to make sure that they don't leak out to the environment.
What is your opinion of performance-based septic systems as it relates to an overall watershed management problem?
Well, I think that I am a supporter of gathering more data on how in various areas our septic tanks are performing. And some of it can be done on an individual septic tank, like when we did tracer studies and we did one house and flushed a tracer down that toilet and looked at that system. But some of it can be done collectively and say, in this watershed, we have all these 100 septic tanks. What's happening to our surface waters and our groundwaters over time? Both of those studies can be more challenging, and they give us they're both needed. Both of those types of studies are needed so that we can improve the way we decide where we're going to put our septic tanks, when we're going to use on-site systems, and when we're going to convert to more modernized wastewater treatment.
Can you refer to a standardization septic system regulations, something we could adopt in our area?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Say again.
Do you have any resources that you could pass on to us about standardization of septic system regulations?
Well, yeah, and we can. So at the state level, like I said, there's sanitary codes that have been developed over time and modified. Some of the older houses, of course, been grandfathered in because they know that ultimately, as things change, they'll be upgraded. And so I think Wisconsin has a very good, and Minnesota in our region. And I think part of that was due to Mark Beauchart's work on viruses and the work that he did in the state of Wisconsin. So that contributed over the last 20 years to some of their state sanitary codes in regard to on-site systems, and Florida as well. So I'm happy to try to locate any of that language if someone would like that. EPA, of course, recommends a septic tank density. And many of our areas, like Florida, was well over EPA's recommended density. And that's why they needed to go in and start looking at performance and what areas that had high density septic tanks needed to be hooked up to a sewer versus could they modernize, do mounding, do advanced, some in situ treatment, septic tanks, things like that. Then there was the setback distances. So, and those vary, they can vary depending on the type of soil. So they might be 50 feet, 100 feet, so on and so forth, from, from a septic tank to a groundwater or to a surface waters. But they may vary in the state depending on the type of soil. But yeah, you'll see these various septic tank, what we call setback distances. And of course, I was just going to say the placing, we know so much more about groundwater and groundwater flows now that that we know that septic tanks here are going to affect this groundwater. It's going to flow, this direction. It's going to flow west or flow east, south, west, north, whatever. And of course, then understanding our groundwater systems in that flow path, other wells in that flow path, and other susceptible, surface waters in that flow path, and then understanding how fast that water flows. So those are all considerations, is some of the hydrology in the soil, and then what's in the flow path down, sort of in the groundwater basin.
Well, you may have already answered this one somewhat. We have an island on our lake with about 30 homes. The septic tanks are not routinely pumped out. Can you discuss the problems and possible solutions?
They're not routinely pumped out?
No.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember Florida trying to get everybody to pump out their septic tanks before storms came in these susceptible areas. And then we also saw this in Lake Erie at Putin Bay. So when storms and winds come in, the groundwater table comes up actually, and it actually interfaces with the drain field, and then it goes down and it pulls a lot of the effluent and the contaminants with it. In an island situation, and this can be, one of the things about wastewater modernization is that we got to think about it long term. And
Let me pay the bill.
Scott,
It's like she's froze temporarily.
Thinks it's her end.
He's the guy from the computer place in town.
Jerry, I apologize. I just want to hang on to it. She has. That's all right.
Yeah, I'm just trying to avoid writing the question.
There was one question that was a double.
Yeah, the first two.
She could be coming back. No.
Do we got to reboot her?
I think she logged off. She can try to log back on real quick.
We have some questions from the chat that when you're done, Scott can read those.
Would reading the question. Anybody?
Are you trying to log back on? You were doing so well.
Technology.
John already said that you went to a house across from the party store over here. It's about a 700-foot house on 4 acres of land. I was there about 3 times Saturday. The door was wide open.
Red House.
Yeah, with the bell. True, yes. Really? Cool. Builder or something? Yeah. She signed? Because I went there too.
So sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I saw you were calling me, David.
We're good.
We're good.
Sorry about that. I just got knocked off for some
Oh.
reason.
That's just fine. We're glad you're back. We were talking about the island we have on our lake.
Right,
And,
right.
For indoor solutions.
Yeah, and so it's an expensive endeavor. I was saying that I do think that these types of recreational areas are gonna need financial support. Because there are wastewater treatment plants that can be packaged wastewater treatment plants. And in many of these places, because you have restaurants and you have other things that have oil and grease, you can set those up so that they are treating the wastewater to a higher level than what would happen, in an island with very limited soil in terms of where the water is going, once it discharges to a septic field. And so that's one, some modern, smaller package plants. But others have tried to, build a system for the whole island. That's a long-term goal. And then just more pumping out, just pumping and then transporting. But all the solutions are fairly, expensive. And we have to think about, again, how we're going to pay for it over that 20, 25, 30, 40, 50 year time frame, spread that payment out and get support from grants and loans that can help these communities.
Okay. Our lake watershed contains around 4,000 septic systems. How does this rank as a potential nutrient/virus source?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about 4,000, so let's say even if you said three people, right? 3 individuals per 4,000, for each septic tank, right? You're talking about a community of 120,000 people. So anytime I monitor wastewater of a population of 500,000 people, whatever, I can always find viruses in the sewage because someone's always infected. There's always somebody in a larger community that has some type of an infection. They're asymptomatic in some cases. And so we do have some data on what percentage of people may have an infection over a year's time frame. So what kind of virus loading might go into the system. We've got a lot of data on SARS right now from some of our various communities, ranging from 1,000 to up to 60,000, 120, 200,000 people. So we have some of that data as an example of a virus. And with nutrients, there's been some models that actually provide loading of how much nutrient per person. So you could actually look at the loading And the nutrients aren't my area of expertise, but I'm sure that there's someone that has already done that. In fact, one of my previous colleagues actually did a study in Higgins Lake in 1980 to look at Higgins Lake as an example, and looked at the little urban pieces that were there. It was quite interesting to see that map from the 1980s. And David, I'm going to send you my PowerPoint as a PDF, and I actually put that little map from that 1980s paper on phosphorus. It's very technical. It's about a model that can say how much loading of phosphorus would come from each person and enter the lake from various sources.
Approximately what year did residential water treatment move from a simple hole in the ground to an actual septic tank?
Well, it actually started around the Civil War. So if you go, just past the Civil War, you started seeing in our communities where it moved from, outhouses. And that was partly due to a freshwater infrastructure, people bringing water into their homes via taps. And it started of course, in the larger cities where they had water, and ultimately they were able to hook up. There was a design, they already had a design that had sort of a flush toilet. You filled the top with water, and then you could flush it into a container, and then standing in a pot, some of these houses, or going out to the outhouse, it accumulated in a holding tank underneath. Eventually, that all got hooked up as we built more pipes for water. Really, until the 1900s, that you saw a lot of a lot more hookups where we had flush toilets. But of course, we had no wastewater treatment, so all the wastewater was just being flushed out into the environment untreated. And that was associated with quite a large number of outbreaks, particularly in the Great Lakes region, because all our water moves to our lakes. It moves and so we were contaminating our drinking water. And interestingly enough, the Great Lakes region started looking at wastewater treatment in the 40s and 50s and 60s, well before the Clean Water Act in 1972, because of that fact that the wastewater was contaminating our drinking water systems. But so one modern aspect of our lives created another problem. We liked having water come into our homes. We liked being able to flush, our waste away, but we weren't treating it. And so that transition happened between the Civil War and the 1900s. And then wastewater treatment was coming in around the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, but it didn't become national law, and most places just had primary treatment until the Clean Water Act in the 70s. And that was considered a really one of the most important laws for protection of public health. And the other reason it was highly successful was also because there were grants designated in that law that provided states with funding to upgrade their wastewater treatment to secondary and disinfection.
This is a two-part question. Is sand a good filtering for removing? Is sand a good filter for removing nitrogen and phosphorus?
Well, no. So nutrients don't get filtered out. They get absorbed. So they're dissolved. Particles get filtered out. So there's a filtration theory. And we've set up columns in our lab that's full of sand, and then maybe sandy loam, maybe some organic material, various kinds of humics, things like that. So you can set up a column, and then you can look at how filtration theory works in removal of particles. So for nutrients, they get absorbed out, and they maybe get absorbed through organic material, and they get taken up by microbes. So if there's activity of microbes in the soil, they take up the phosphorus. It happens more in aerobic systems, and also plants will take up some of the phosphorus. So there are other mechanisms, but filtration is not a mechanism that removes nutrients.
Can you discuss problems with density? How much housing density is a problem which could be resolved by a step system, or when is a step system needed?
Well, I think a step system is just another way of saying we're going to make sure that the effluent is not, discharging to the environment, right, in our community. Yeah, I've seen, I've seen densities that, like you're supposed to have densities of maybe not more than, 5 houses for less an acre for septic tanks. I've seen those kind of densities being recommended. But we generally have much higher densities in our peri-urban areas and around our lake systems. And we just built that. We built that up over time without the scientific knowledge that we now have on hydrology.
How dangerous would it be if 2,000 gallons of raw sewage went into a lake from a broken sewer line?
Yeah, so clearly spills, untreated wastewater spills, and combined sewer overflows are a danger. And what we've looked at is how much time, if you have so much untreated sewage go into a water system, how much time would you, for example, have to close a beach, or, of course, you might look at monitoring groundwater, but in surface waters, we look at time for the inactivation of these organisms. And depending on, of course, if it's the winter, they could persist quite a long time. If it's the summer, the sunlight and the temperatures start degrading these organisms within, a week, down to non-detect levels. So of course it depends on the time, but any untreated wastewater that is discharged to surface waters where there's recreation, where there's drinking water intakes, poses a risk.
If you could only do one thing to reduce nutrients to our watershed, what would be our best, most effective thing to do?
Well, in an area like Higgins Lake, where there's not much agriculture, it's forest and urban, it's really taking care of the urban sources. In other watersheds where there's quite a bit of agriculture, it's fertilizers and manure management. Wetlands, are a big sink for some of these. Like I said, plants and other things will take nutrients up, they'll also take up microbes. So I like the idea of enhancing our environmental buffers in these environments, and thinking about how we kind of return to nature and look at nature-based solutions where we can combine engineering and nature to do our work. The problem is that septic tanks primarily rely on nature, and in some cases we've just overwhelmed the capacity of nature to take care of what we're adding to the environment.
That's the questions that I have here, but I believe there's some chat questions.
I'm gonna turn on this other light. I
Scott,
see I
can
don't
you-
have any lights on and it's getting dark. Just, yeah, go ahead.
Yep, I have a few here on the chat. Some of these are spin-offs of the questions we got, and others are new questions here. First one here says, if we aren't monitoring here at Higgins Lake, then how do we know a sewer is needed? And kind of a two-parter, is the state and county health departments considering changes to how close septics and wells can be to each other?
I don't know at the state level how far along the conversation is to look at, whether there's a statewide approach to evaluating setback distances. In terms of monitoring, Higgins Lake is quite monitored. What I said was septic tanks, our individual septic tanks and our individual wells are not monitored. So we don't monitor our individual septic tank to see. I have a septic tank myself. When the effluent goes off, I don't monitor that. I don't capture that effluent and monitor it. I can monitor the canal that's near my house, but most people don't have a lab, and I can monitor my own well. But so that's what I meant by septic systems are not monitored. Higgins Lake, though, is quite monitored. And that's why I thought it was interesting that I found this study back from 1980, where they were looking at using Higgins Lake as a quite pristine lake, and looking at phosphorus inputs from the urban and the sources in Higgins Lake at that time. And they were using it to show their model, to show how their model could be ground truthed onto how much phosphorus was coming from some of the urban areas into the lake. So Higgins Lake in and of itself is quite monitored. And I think that, if I'm not mistaken, but I haven't seen the report, but I did hear that there was some monitoring of groundwater and wells in the area. And there was some concern of some nitrates in the wells, but I do not know where that report is. I would have to try to hunt that down.
Next question here, kind of a follow-up. Any idea why Michigan is the only state without a mandate to monitor existing sewers? Maybe that's existing septic systems.
Yeah, so the state does, under the Clean Water Act, the state does manage what we call the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. So all wastewater treatment plants do have to monitor what they discharge. And they have to follow a certain treatment. But the state does not have a state sanitary code. So what that means is that, especially for our our communities that are on septic tanks, we may have an ordinance could be developed by the county, by our city, by our township. And so we have a fragmented approach in Michigan because we don't have a state sanitary code. And why we don't have one, it's not clear to me historically why. I believe historically it was just believed that the individual townships at that time, as Michigan was growing, would have the resources to put a regulation into place and do the monitoring. But it's clear now after the last 20 years that the state really should come in with resources and support a state sanitary code. But the wastewater treatment plants still fall under the Clean Water Act, still have monitoring and a national permit under the National Discharge Elimination System. So they have to have a permit, wastewater treatment plants.
Which type of soil is the best for filtration?
Well, it's about grain size. So, you know, and also by filtration, I presume they mean removal, removal of microbes or maybe nutrients. So when we build filtration systems that we add onto wastewater plants, we actually add a little carbon in there, powdered activated carbon, because it absorbs out things. So we can do that, and absorbs out pharmaceuticals and things like that. Sand in of itself, if it's just pure sand, it doesn't absorb very much. So it's really about the grain size and where they are with each other and how the water flows through all the grain that's packed together. But if you have loamy soils, if you have more organics in there, of course, the more organics that you have in there and humics and clays, then the water doesn't flow so well, but it's a pretty good barrier so you're trying to reach a happy balance between the water flowing through the system. So a sandy, loamy soil, so the water does flow through the system, but then has some capacity for filtering out like protozoa, bacteria, and of course, then the distance from these other waterways and distance and time, then impacts some of the other contaminants.
I think you may have touched on this a little bit already here, but is there a standard or recommendation for how many septic systems in a square mile radius that would be acceptable before there's definite harm?
There's different densities proposed, and this is again related to soil type. It's related to the water movement. How fast does the water move? The groundwater table. So if you're in Arizona and the groundwater is 100 feet and you got, you know, there's a different strategy there. But EPA does have some suggested densities per square mile, and I'll get that material and send it so that you have the range and the conditions that they have looked at. And these are national studies, so they kind of look at what's happening throughout the US, the different kinds of conditions throughout the US. But I'll try to locate one or two of the better EPA reports that could inform the community.
Since the effluents are filtered in the soil in a septic system, is there a concern that the soil is being contaminated, creating another source of contamination, not just groundwater and surface water?
The soil will absorb the contaminants, and then they'll degrade over time, depending on the type of contaminant that's there. So you can, I mean, like if somebody is digging into a drainage, you know, a drainage field, and this has been an issue with the septic tank industry that has to go in and fix a tile drain or because it's clogged or something like that. That soil is considered contaminated and would have to go to a landfill or, you know, and then, yeah, most likely if they dug it up, it would go to a landfill in Michigan.
Okay. Next one says, could you say more about conventional municipal systems versus STEP? Just maybe elaborate between the difference, or if there is any difference between those as they relate to a sewer system.
So, my understanding, and I haven't studied a STEP system, but my understanding of its design is that it minimizes the costs, the cost of wastewater treatment, part of it is a sewer, right? Putting in the pipes, and it's same with drinking water. Always putting in the pipes is the expensive part, digging up the roads and laying all the pipes and all the pipes and the distances and these kinds of things. And so the idea is that if you have storage and you can create a smaller pipe system to collect the wastewater, and then use your traditional approaches where you pump it out to take it to a wastewater treatment plant like you would a septic tank. It just doesn't discharge to the environment. And they can be built and placed underground. They can be sized, they can have different sizes. They do have some treatment like a septic tank where they take out some of the solids initially, but all the effluent would not be discharged to the environment. And I think that it's more of a cost issue and a issue of, in some communities, it doesn't make sense to build, maybe a huge network of sewer that runs all the way to a wastewater plant. And that's because it may be a long distance, and that one pipe that takes all the sewer, the smaller pipes, and then all the wastewater goes to bigger pipes, and eventually it runs to a wastewater plant. That one pipe could be very expensive. And so it's about trying to, be, I guess, innovative in a way that doesn't add extra costs for communities that are of certain sizes. That's my understanding.
I can add just a little bit of, I guess, technical clarity on it from the engineering side here. For all intents and purposes, a step system and a conventional system at the end of the day accomplish the same ultimate treatment. With a conventional system, it's just that the solids are all conveyed with the liquid to the plant at one time. Where a step system, we're just transporting the liquid, and then we haul the solids to the plant at a later date for treatment. And as Joan mentioned,
so you don't have to have the same kind of pipe system and all of that to.
Correct.
Yeah.
The hydraulics around the lake with a flat area, it's more conducive to a pumped step system.
Right. And that way it's not as costly.
Yep.
Yeah. Very good. Thanks, Scott.
Yep, no problem. This says, does the EPA and DEQ allow sewage pipes under the lake to pump from the island to the mainland?
I do not know the answer to that. I do think there are some examples, but a lot of our wastewater systems, which is why we're trying to, refurbish them, have leaky pipes. And so the new pipe systems that we would put in are ones that are not going to leak. And we keep the leaking at a minimum, which also helps with stormwater, by the way, because what leaks out leaks in. So I don't know of any larger wastewater systems where they built a pipe to a mainland wastewater treatment plant. Like I've said, I think they've probably built smaller package wastewater treatment plants on the island itself. I'd have to investigate that, but I don't know of any.
Does clear cutting harm filtration?
Say again?
Does clear cutting, maybe forests, does that harm filtration?
Well, for runoff, if you talk about water and water movement over the surface, when you don't have certain plants and you clear cut, whenever water runs over the surface, it carries with it more soil. It carries with it more stuff. Filtration, I think, can be affected by plants, the type of plants that you have in the area. I do know of, special designs, innovative designs where they've used submerged plants to improve nutrient removal while the water's being filtered. So it was more focused on nutrient removal by the plants and enhancing that while the water was being filtered. So filtration in and of itself is a process where the water moves, vertically down through the soil. But of course, there's a lot of other issues with removing wetlands and forests in terms of soil and runoff. And probably nutrient removal as well.
Relative to the raw sewage spill question, is a step system safer than conventional because it only has effluent in the pipes?
I don't think so. I think what is really key is that because these are new and they're designed, to, as I guess, Scott, you may be able to answer this better than me. The piping is very, very clean, tight piping so that you don't have leaking. So you don't have leaks. And if you don't have the solids running through these pipes, your pipes are probably going to have greater longevity.
Good. Next one here is I have a new well less than 5 years old at 90-foot depth and have tested for excessive levels of nitrates in my well. I'm located on Higgins Lake by the Cut River and have a septic located approximately 70 feet from the lake, and the well is another 100 feet toward the street side of the property. The property has been there since 1975. I think we are saturated along the lake. Question,
So they did test positive for nitrate in that well. So is that what it said, Scott?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep. I think they're asking, is it possible that it's saturated around that area?
Yeah, like I said, nutrients are interesting because they're legacy pollutants, what I call legacy pollutants. And they're doing some excellent studies on how long it takes up in Minnesota and in Florida even to get rid of, these legacy pollutants. And we put all this money to get rid of the nutrients. And then, 2 years later, we see no effect. Well, we're not going to see an effect for 10 years. And so if we haven't been doing anything to control these legacy pollutants for the previous 30 years, they're going to be accumulating. And now we're just now starting to monitor. So, yeah, I think, we probably overwhelmed the environment in that regard.
Do the sand and gravel, the coarse sand and gravel in the soil plus the high water table in the Higgins Lake watershed susceptible to allowing the free flow of nutrients and virus materials potentially negatively impacting the watershed? So I think they're saying, are the soil types making the watershed more susceptible to impact?
Talking, we can't hear.
Thank you. I got muted, and so the host had to help me out there. Okay, say the question was about viruses and Scott, can you give me the question again?
Yep, it said, do the soil types, the coarse sand and gravel, plus the high groundwater table that's present within the watershed, make it more susceptible to impact of free-flowing nutrients and virus materials? Yes,
definitely. The higher the water table, and the coarser the sand. We did some things in the coral reef environment where they had septic tanks all along. For some reason, they had built up the Florida Keys, and there's no sand, no soil there really. And what we put down the toilet ended up in the canal in 1 hour. No, so the coarser things are, the faster that water moves there. So, you know, coarse and sandy soils, high water table, saturated water means the water is moving. And of course, it all moves. It moves to the lake. That's why we have lakes. It moves to the river systems. Groundwater feeds our river systems and feeds our lakes. So, and I know there's springs as well in Higgins Lake. And these springs also probably bring in water that move a little faster than some of the groundwater as well.
I think this is the last one here. Is there an additive that can be introduced to the septic system that will aid in the removal of contaminants?
They are looking at new designs of septic tanks where you get in situ treatment. One is actually just adding air, like we do at a wastewater treatment plant. When we add air instead of as you know, that sulfur smell, if you've ever, those smelly smells you get if you've ever been around when your septic tank is being pumped or whatever, that's because there's no air down there. And so there are some new designs where you can get some in situ treatment. They're being evaluated, and like even designing the way that the effluent flows out into the soil system, modifying the drain field, the soil and the drain field, so you get more absorption and you get more filtration in those systems. So there are some innovative systems. They cost more. I don't know how cost effective they are for a community, you know, for everyone in a community to have an advanced system. But I think there is going to be a goal of improving innovation for on-site wastewater treatment in the future.
Oh, one more here. Does water clarity in the lake mean there aren't problems with the lake from contamination from septics?
Well, increasing clarity definitely is probably related to decreasing nutrients. So, especially phosphorus and algae and that type of thing. You could still have other problems if, let's say, for example, the nutrients are being removed, but there's a pharmaceutical. Like I said, some of these are conservative. They don't absorb, and they're very recalcitrant. And so we could still have something like that pops up new, like PFAS, that is moving to the lake with our effluents. So I think that's why it's really important for us to be vigilant on emerging contaminants and emerging concerns. And but water clarity, I think, is definitely associated with improving the removal of nutrients out of some of these lake systems.
Are you done, Scott? I have one
Yep.
more here. Does seasonality of lake residents affect regeneration of a septic field, better functioning of a field system?
Well, the freeze thaw, you know, like if nobody's using it and you get, you know, you can get a freeze and then a thaw, that can change the filtration. It could either, you know, decrease the clogging because you get degradation over time, or you could get fissures, you could get cracking, you know, in that system that allows more water to run through faster than it normally would. It doesn't actually get filtered because it runs through these little cracks. So it could happen either way. I don't know how many studies have been done that look at the change in, you know, throughout a season, through the winter, and then of course towards the spring and the summer. We do know that things start moving, you know, when it warms up and thaws out. So you'll see things, you know, moving. And of course, that's also the time when there's more people. So is it really related to just hydrology and more people, or is it related to something functioning in terms of the soil system between a freeze thaw? And I don't know of any studies that have really looked at that. But it's an interesting question, whether it would change the, you know, the drain field and the filtration and absorption capacity of your tile drain.
That's all I have.
Anyone else from the audience?
I got a question.
Well, I think you write it down, sir?
You want me to write it down?
Yeah. Thank you.
I did write it down.
Yeah.
Which card?
There's a lot of good questions there. Coming from the community.
Yes.
While he's writing that one down, we got one more. What type of plants can be integrated into the lake or near the lake to help remove contaminants?
To modify.
Ooh.
question.
I don't know the answer to that question, but there are studies where they've looked at certain types of plants, duckweed and other things. Of course, you may not want that, or hyacinths. They and mostly they take out nutrients, and they're managed so that you grow them in a certain area. The water flows through there. Before it would go to the lake, for example, they would take out the nutrients, and then they'd have to harvest the hyacinths. So I do know there's groups looking at those kinds of plants, but it would be like a system where you'd want it to go through that a hyacinth pond and then come into the lake so that the nutrients were removed by the plants, and then you take the plants out and use the plants for something, or bury them, or.
This is the takeoff of the last question that we had. With a system that does not get used often, say only gets used 3 or 4 months out of the year, how does that affect the regeneration of the septic field? Does that make it better or not?
Well, I don't know about regeneration. I think that you have a soil drain field, right? And I think that if it dries, if it's wet and dry, right? Because you're not using it, so that the septic tank, the effluent fills up in the septic tank, then it starts to spill out into the drain field. I do know that when we've seen a lot of water going through, they create these preferential flow paths. And that means the water is going through the pathway of least resistance, so in the soil. And like I said, I think there's at least a couple of papers in certain types of soils that when it dries out and then it gets wet again, that you don't have as many of these preferential flow paths. So that could be a benefit. I don't know that, of course, that's a benefit to the filtration and the organisms, but not so much for the smaller stuff, for the nutrients and the and maybe the viruses. But for the larger stuff like the bacteria, you could get better filtration then.
Okay, we got another one. Microbial markers. Is it difficult / expensive to prove the nutrients in the lake can be attributed to human waste?
So we've done some watershed studies most recently where we've been correlating and relating the markers, whether it's the bull, cow, the pig, the human marker, to the nutrients. And so you measure all these things at the same time. And these are watersheds. I don't think that study's been done in Higgins Lake, although there's I think some source tracking that's been done there for human marker. But a coordinated study where you look at input of nutrients and the markers themselves to see, what the source is, to try to relate the source. So it can be done. the good thing about these microbial source tracking markers is that the state of Michigan has about 19 laboratories around the state. They monitor beaches, and they are developing the capacity right now to do source tracking markers, learning all the methods and being able to take the samples and get them to the lab in time and get the results out and work in their, so to speak, in their own backyard. And these are county health labs, some of the other university labs. So the state of Michigan has this a network of advanced technology laboratories that can run the source tracking, and that'll make it less expensive. But you do have to design the study so that you take enough samples over time and space, and you do the nutrient and the markers at the same time. So those studies are, you know, I don't know that any study like that has been completely funded within Higgins Lake.
Okay.
You good, Scott?
Yep, Scott got no more.
Yep, that's all of them.
Okay. Well, Dr. Rose, on behalf of our audience up here, we thank you so much for your time. It's been informative, and hopefully we can get you back in a couple of months and maybe do some follow-up questions.
Yeah, for sure. I part of my portfolio, and that's I've done that in Florida, and when I worked in Arizona and Florida, and of course here is to do what I call engage science, and to work with communities and try to think about how we can use our advanced tools and approaches to solve community problems. So I really appreciate you inviting me. And like I said, I really like the interaction, and the community has great questions, and it's a challenging, you know, issue we're facing around the nation in terms of modernizing the way we handle our wastewater to protect our, you know, our water quality.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. Thanks again, and have a pleasant evening. And Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful evening yourselves. Thank you very much. We'll be in touch. And
Okay.
David, I can follow up with a PDF of my slides, and also I'll try to find those EPA reports.
You bet. Thank you so much. Scott, thank you. Well, at the end of our evening, we're time of public comment. If anyone has a comment that they wish to make, please come forward, and you have 3 minutes. And I don't know if it's working. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna try to help educate.
Maybe we should.
They didn't see me bring something.
Dr. Rose, this. Dr. Rose.
Another thing.
Okay.
No. Fuck.
Okay. What I just presented to you, last time I commented about an incinerator program for the island. Okay. As I mentioned, you know, that was something I'm not really an expert at, so I went out and researched it. What I just provided you is actually a quotation from Ecojon for an incendiary program that you put on the island. Okay. Depending on the capacity that's needed, it'll be determined if we can get away with 1 system or 2 systems. There's engineering information, design information in that for that. Okay, and I'm not, you know, since we got little time, it's more for you than the public. But the cost of it, for considering we have to have maximum capacity, which would be 2 systems, would be, boy, $369,940. That's for 2 systems, turnkey systems on the island to do the incineration. That works out to be $14,000 $797 per household based on 25 houses being on that system, which is very reasonable. That eliminates that line that goes from the island to the shore that can rupture. You've got fusion joints there, as you know, engineers know that's one of your weak joints. Okay, you've got thrust issues in there. All that pipe has to do is vibrate, move a little bit on a sharp rock somewhere. It will wear a hole in that pipe. That's why I'm against that line going from the shore to the island. The cost to operate the system based at max capacity for the 2 units is about $114 a month for the residents, based on an annual usage divided by 12. Keep in mind, peak season is going to be in the summertime, so more fuel, which is propane, would have to be used. In an incinerator program, the ash is considered sterile. You get away from your biohazards, so you can transport. Propane is not a hazardous material or a marine concern or an ecological issue. It's flammable, but it's not gas, so it's not considered a hazardous material. So unfortunately, the island doesn't have anything other than electricity over there, from what I know, so we would have to use propane, okay? And there's, you know, I'll leave it to other engineers and other people to work out that if you go that way. And I'm just trying to hit the high points because we're short on time. I also have information in there about a system from Aerostream, which is a aerobic system, which Doctor was talking about, where you can actually put it in your septic tanks. Of course, you gotta have a septic tank that can receive it, not a 55-gallon drum sitting out there. That company estimated between $200 and $800 to upgrade septic tanks. Okay, of course, that depends on what's in that yard. I also put on there 2 things out of the Lyon Township engineering report. Because when I was pulling costs, because the step system, when I figured the cost for the step system on the island, it's gonna be $1,562,000 to do the step system. That's running the line, horizontal, drilling it, etc. So we're looking at over $1 million savings between an incinerator program and a low pressure sewer system.
We're at 4 minutes.
Keep on.
Okay.
No, it's good. Good information.
Yeah, so, it's definitely something that's gotta be looked at. Copy of email from, copy of email from EcoJohn's there, so you actually have the email address to, do your communications. Dealing with the South Lyon engineering report, when I was pulling costs off for the step system, I found an error in the calculation between the combination of a gravity fed system and a step system. There's a figure in there for horizontal drilling. Okay, they don't have that on the step system. And the step system, I figure, is about $21 million that was left off that. So not that it really means too much, other than the step system actually comes out more expensive than the combination system because of that. And it's mathematical error, something was left out. There's a lot of stuff. Design's not done, as we all know, so those figures can actually change. But the main thing is there was a key part left off. I'm going to wrap it up. If people have any questions, we can do it after if you want, or contact me.
Maybe we should invite some of these guys to join us.
That's all up to you. Yeah, and it's a turnkey, and they'll actually do the engineering and technical support for the system on the island, so you're not paying all the additional engineering. Secondly, you can actually isolate that and take it right off the map, and I know the island's problem. So, thank you very much.
Anyone else? Yeah.
My name is Dr. Kevin Kessler, and I'm a mathematical biologist and data scientist. I grew up coming to Higgins Lake and am now a year-round resident. This past summer, I've been speaking in these meetings about the importance of bringing our community together, speaking with many different stakeholders and experts, regarding their views on the sewer system and the Higgins Lake ecosystem in general, and working with colleagues from an international nonprofit focused on sustainable growth to try and find a way to establish a dialogue to help heal the rift this issue has caused in our community so that everyone can work together to address all of the political, environmental, and technical concerns to find a win-win solution for everyone. Over the past 6 months, I have had many congenial conversations with people who have diverse points of view regarding the sewer project proposed by GLUA, and I believe everyone I talk to is acting in what they truly believe are the best interests of Higgins Lake and its community. In these discussions, I've come to understand that while we all have any number of shared values, a good faith dialogue cannot exist due to differing assumptions and lack of information that both sides can agree on. In addition, grievances from past battles in the community still provide obstacles to working together. As a result, I have come to realize that the only way to have a productive dialogue is in the context of a shared, or at least agreed upon, body of knowledge. I believe the discussion should be centered around knowledge based on professional expertise and empirical evidence to the greatest extent possible. I also feel that regardless of people's beliefs, they deserve a seat at the table and the right to share what values and issues are important to them, voice their concerns and have them respected, ask and or answer questions, and be able to find relevant information from documented sources. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. And in a healthy community, there can be many opinions and vigorous debate about issues, so long as there's a shared context that everyone understands, even if they don't necessarily agree with it. To this end, I am proposing to collect information about the sewer project and Higgins Lake in general in order to build a place where knowledge can be vetted and collected, a place for members of the community to share their values, concerns, stories, and questions, a place to build consensus around community projects and support their implementation, starting with the sewer project. And I hope to start by interviewing people, doing video interviews, collecting them, putting up on the web, and then building a website, and hopefully get professionals to Dr. Rose and other people who have expertise and people who have engineering expertise to discuss the technical details. And I would definitely like to invite Mr. Kniffick to do an interview, because I want to hear more about what you said, because I think you're absolutely right that we need a system that's not going to make matters worse on the island. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Would you email me your questions?
I will do that.
Anyone else? Any board announcements?
I'll speak, Dave.
Yeah, come on.
It's David Hobson. Hey, Dr. Rose did a good job. It was nice hearing some of her information. Couple of quick things. I would encourage you guys, the GLUA board, to ask her. I wanted to ask her an additional question, which is, she mentioned that she did have a septic system, I believe. If there was one, I would ask her this question, if there was one thing that she could do to improve the performance of her own septic system, what would that be? I wish I would have asked that question. I will do that afterwards, but I wanted to share that with you. Also happy to see that you guys are keeping the questions, and I presume we'll be studying them a little bit further. I will remind the GLUA board that Roscommon County is one of the poorest counties in Michigan. And 2/3 of the registered voters are over 65 years of age and on a fixed income. So please keep that in mind as you're considering this project and alternatives. Couple quick questions, if it's okay to ask a question. I believe Dave Kniffick presented some information September 12th. The Aranco Engineering and Design Manual talked about giving a blanket blanket easement rather
to the townships of the residents' property that would allow townships total access to residents' property, including being able to put additional equipment anywhere on the residents' property. I think you guys were gonna look into that matter. Is that something that you guys have had a chance to look into yet, or whether you would use blanket language or possibly try to tailor that a little bit more to the situation? Anyone looked at that language?
We'll do that during our board.
Okay, and also I would ask this question, that I think Dave brought this up, Mr. Benefic as well. That was true, I think the Oreco manual alluded to all liability would ultimately be put on the shoulders of the residents for anything that would take place, such as an accident or catastrophic occurrence with the step system. So I just wondered if you guys have had any discussion about that language yet, and that's it.
Thank you. Make sure you write the question down.
Have you guys discussed that at all, or not? So you're gonna not comment on it tonight? Okay, okay. That's it.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Brian Nelson.
I would just like to ask the board, as I talk to my neighbors about the system and the cost, I think it's scaring a lot of people when they're considering, do they want to stay, do they leave the state and retirement? I'm gonna leave there. Not that I can't, I mean, they're $80 a month, $100 a month, close to 20,000 or so upfront. But a lot of people can't. And it's a burden on their property when they sell it, if they don't pay it up front. And just is the lake truly in that much peril that we property, if you invest $40,000 for 30 years to address this? Is that the type of right? Or replacements targeted, bring things up to code near the lake. Just want to keep that in consideration. That there are a lot of people who are wondering whether they can stay.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. So I've got a couple of questions about board activities. I missed this September of business on September, whatever you did there, but I'm just reading through the minutes. In a past meeting, you had discussed that you were going to start looking into a commercial property already used, finalize something. I saw an example. I think it was Oakland County. I don't remember now. There were several. Or if they're making any progress on that. The vacant lot charges, you had an open discussion on that topic about what your feelings were about what charges you wanted to move forward with anything like that. Some people out says not what they know where you're going to land on that before they decide if they're for or against that system. Likewise, commercial property, a lot of the owners of commercial properties are worried that you're going to put them out of business by setting their reviews high for their particular business. Are they getting work on finalizing something like that? Make that public. Wondered about if you heard anything from the Conservancy about the tip of the myth report coming in October. That's what I heard last. I haven't heard. Okay. And then I just wanted to thank Michelle. She took time out of her day to let a small group of us coming in and look at the petition. Box of petition. And I taking the time to do that. She answered a bunch of questions while we were sitting there. And good move, open move. Oh, I have.
No. Okay, hearing none, board comments. Aaron.
We've heard a lot of information today. Most of it, I think we all knew. Some of it was kind of new to me. I think it's great that we've got the participation, especially from Dave, and possible alternatives. And I know the island's a big concern for everybody. I was kind of surprised that, you know, we're planning on a pipe of waste coming across the bottom. And it would be wonderful if we could find a different solution for that. This looks like a lot of studying, you know, a lot of information to absorb, things like that. And Kevin Kessler's got the right idea as well, as far as some sort of forum for communication and exchange of thoughts, and hopefully getting, you know, the facts lined up and allowing for emotions, but maybe putting them in a box on the side sometimes. And we'll see what the future holds, I guess.
Jim,
Okay, yeah, as far as the tip of the net, and I think last time I suggested we get together with the HLC, HLU. And I have, you know, spoken to the president of the HLC, and he said he's going to be in contact, you know, with coordinator with HLU. And last I, well, he's out of town now to the 4th of November, and he didn't expect him before that. So then I said, well, yeah, it makes sense if we gather the information, and sit down with that. Sometime in November. Hopefully we'll be done. And so that is progressing, with input, you know, whatever the tip of the net says, and also maybe, you know, I'm not sure if they're doing cross analysis of different options, but hopefully we'll look at that. Personally, I've been looking, and we've had, you know, since I have been out asking for petitions, a lot of the things that come about the vacant lots. It's not vacant necessarily lots, but it's vacant buildable parcels. Because we have 2 lots next to each other by the ordinances of the non-conforming lots. A lot of times it's considered as one. Or the option is to combine. So I'll get a handle on that, so we can, when you talk to people, we say, well, hey, you got these 250-foot lots. They're only gonna be assessed as one. And then there's also, I've talked to some, I got a problem with somebody today. They have a 50 by 50 lot, which is 2,500 square feet. Doesn't meet any ordinance. It's not even, it's my opinion, it's not an assessable lot. So then we do need to get those items straightened out so that, you know, we convey that to people, you know, and then there are some benefits, as I think I said last time, that have an assessment, which will be reduced and spread it over 20 years. If your intent is, if you bought that lot for speculation, or if you bought it to build on and sometime down the future, you really pay a couple $100, because there's going to be a special assessment, but anybody that comes in later, you know, will have to make up that cost. So it's either now or later. You know, we're not going to say that, you know, if you have a vacant lot, you can build in 5 years. It's not going to be free. We have to pick up those things that aren't assessed. So would you rather have it spread out over 30 years, that cost? Or would you rather have to come in here and write a check for that assessable one? We need to get a handle on that as far as, you know, what actually is an accessible. Like I say, the person today, that I had the contact, they have a 50 by 50 lot just standing on it. And it's not built by any sort of ordinance. As far as the easements, I did read the easement, you know, perma rental, lacking in my opinion, because my feeling is that the authority should be liable for their portion. And it's saying the homeowner, they're going to be liable for their portion. And I see a lot of these easements are written such that, you know, if the homeowner goes and screws up, you know, the authority's property or the authorities, you know, if they go in there and try to, you know, they break up the control panel, or if they unbolt the the cover, then they could be held liable for damage to that property, as well as the authority would be responsible. In my opinion. And I've seen it written that way. If they go in there and, you know, they're doing something and one of the pieces of equipment breaks, you know, a window in the house or runs into the side of the house. Or I have a contract under the corner of our office building, one's going to be the property. They, that case, so that is, but we are still a little ways away from having a project at this point. So there's that the movements do need to be addressed. And they've got to be fair, and who's ever responsible should be liable, be it the authority or whatever. The other thing I wanted to point out is, and again, this is just because I've been talking to people, F&B, they do not have the contract for all the work. They are not, you know, contracted to do the same. They're not contracted to the construction management. They will be, you know, asked to bid. It'll probably be, you know, out. And we'll have to talk to people about that. The other thing is a rental is, it's kind of like Kleenex. You go down to the store, you don't have to buy Kleenex, you don't have to buy a rental. And whenever you do public work, you have to bid it out, and you have to have alternatives, and you have to have qualifications. We don't want to get a brand new company that just started building pumps and tile filters immediately. So there will be some standards there, and it'll be spec'd out, and it'll have and or equal, but they'll also have to be qualified manufacturers of equipment. Oh, and one thing I just wanted to mention is back in, I think it was either July or August. Like days, maybe you may know, but someone mentioned the DEQ. They had supported the sewer in a letter in April or May, and one resident said that we would be forthcoming, receiving a letter from them rescinding that endorsement.
We've never received it.
Okay, I just want to confirm that. Okay, I'm done.
Very.
Yeah, just real quick, thanks Dave for bringing the information on the incinerator. And also the gentleman sitting right ahead of Dave, comments regarding, are we considering the cost and affordability of the system? Absolutely, and both townships have come out and said that they will not recommend going forward with the system without substantial funding. And not speaking for the board in general, but Dave kind of hinted at a sweet spot that might make it affordable to a good share of the residents, but not all. And I think it would be fall on our responsibility to seek further assistance for those people that are on fixed incomes that maybe can't afford it. We are in economically disadvantaged areas as recognized by the state. So there is funding out there. It's just, it has to be found. So in answer to your question, yes, that's the number one priority. Is the affordability.
David?
Let me see, 1, 2, 3. I'm the fourth person, and I just concur with what's been said already, and I would only be repeating it, but I would say that thank you very much, everyone, for coming, because I thought it was a good meeting today. And one of the things that was good was some what was brought to our attention on the incinerator for the island. We've had some conversations of other ways to handle the island other than an incinerator. And so we'll add this to that thought process so we can evaluate a way to perhaps handle the island a little less money than how it was first outlined for us. And I think that parallels our thinking. And so thanks for bringing that, and thanks for the work that you did, David.
So I heard some questions. How did you decide this, or what are you going to do about that? And I'm new to the board. This is my second meeting, but I don't know how we function, quite frankly. All I see is motions about approving the minutes and approving the agenda. I don't see any motions to do any work. So what you see is what you get. If you're here and you see us discussing something or making motions, that's all we did. There isn't anything going on behind the scenes like that. We can't do that. So that's what I'd like to say. When are we going to get to actually working on this, and making motions?
Soon as somebody writes us $100 million check.
Yeah. So be patient with us. We're going to get there. Everything you've heard said is true. We're going to make it affordable for everyone, and specifically the island. I don't think we can afford, we can expect the people on the island to pay for their own share specifically. We as a family or a group have to share in all those costs, whether you live along the shoreline or whether you live off the shoreline or whether you're on the island. It's got to be divided equal so that it's affordable for everybody. The islanders can't pay for just doing that job themselves. It's too expensive. Dave, I think you brought up a good alternative to that pipe underground. I'm going to look at it myself. But I don't know how we can discuss it or come to a conclusion. I'm going to find that out eventually. But everything's public here. So what you hear is what's being done. I learned a lot from this Dr. Rose here about the nutrients and the viruses not being removed. Some of the other bacteria is removed, but not the nutrients and the viruses. So all the nitrogen and the phosphorus is just going right into the water supply. We all know that this is a sandy area up here, and it's not a filter for any of these things. So we have a problem with that. Also, she talked about legacy pollutants. I did not know that, but that's a concern, that the nitrogen and the phosphorus is there, and it's slowly going in, and it's going to continue to go in. We heard her talk about the soil type, the water table, and the water movement, all of which are working against us here. And as far as density, around the big cities, she talked about how it's about the pollutants are going into the Great Lakes because of the density. Well, we're getting density around here, and it's going into Higgins Lake. That's what's leading us to what we do. So it was real good, and thank you all for coming, and I hope you all got a lot out of it too.
Yes, sir.
The only thing, I guess that her presentation was great, but the liability in the easement was brought up. This was brought up a long time ago, and we went to FB about it, asked them, and they answered the question. The liability is on the utility, is us. So that's our equipment. It's no different than you look at it is with consumers put the pole in your yard. Okay. First of all, you got to give them permission to do that. You got to give them an easement. That's what the easement's about. They can go up to that pole. They can't go anywhere on your property. They can only go where the easement has been given to them. And then as far as the liability, if their pole falls over in your house, they're responsible for it. You cut it down, that's a different story, right? So the liability is on our utility authority, based on the information that their lawyer gave to us. This was months ago. And the easement as well. Each individual person would have to give easement because we got to get to our equipment that we're putting on your property. That makes sense? So, other than that, that's all I got to say. Thank you.
I want to thank everybody again for coming out tonight. I want to let the public know what we're doing, what the township is doing as far as getting the necessary equipment to stream meetings from this room. We've got two businesses quoting cameras. We're going to put a 65-inch flat screen on the wall with 4 articulating mounts so we can swing it out so that we can have meetings like this. And it'll be a self-contained unit. It'll have a drop down, plug in the computer, grab power off of one of these outlets, and we'll be able to stream not only these meetings, but township meetings, planning commission meetings, zoning board of appeal meetings. Everything will be streamed. I understand that I'm 75 years old, and the technology that I know is contained in my phone, and how I get to FaceTime to see my grandson play soccer. So we have two excellent companies that are quoting us the equipment. And hopefully it'll be in operation in the month of December. Moving forward in that regard. Scott? I just want to see if you were awake. Are you watching football? This information that Dave Kniffik brought in, I'm going to scan it and I'm going to send it to you tomorrow. I want you guys to take a look at it and be prepared to respond back at an appropriate time. Again, thanks everybody for coming out. Well, I really want to thank Dave Hall. He's been working all day to make sure that we had the television, which by the way, they donated to the township. Make sure that we were scrambling around here for about 2.5 to 3 hours this afternoon to make sure that everything was up and running, because we are also technically
Challenged.
advanced here. But we got it done. It was a good job. Scott, have a good night. Thank you, and thank you all. And we stand adjourned at, oh no, I got a motion to adjourn at 9:05. Any further discussion by board? Hearing none, all in favor, motion say aye.